This week on Inside Olympia, aviation and Washington State are synonymous. We are, after all, the birthplace of Boeing. But what does the future of aviation look like? On the program, David Fleckenstein, the state's Director of Aviation. Plus, where will Washington's next airport be? We ask Warren Hendrickson and Steve Edmiston of the Commercial Aviation Coordinating Commission.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport is reaching capacity, and that has the state looking for places to expand airport capacity. But it's a tough sell in local communities. In our second half, we'll talk with two members of Washington's Aviation Coordinating Commission, the group tasked with identifying where a new or expanded airport could go. But first, Washington and aviation are inextricably linked. This is the state that birthed the Boeing company, and today, companies like Blue Origin are looking to expand flight into space. Plus, someday you might get picked up in a flying Uber or Lyft. So what does the future of aviation in Washington look like? Joining me now is David Fleckenstein, the Director of Aviation at the Washington Department of Transportation. Welcome to the program. Good to see you.
Thanks, and thanks for having me today.
A lot to talk about in this space, no pun intended, and we'll start with bringing us up to speed on where we are in 2022, on the verge of 2023, in a fast-growing state. Sometimes I don't think we realize how fast we're growing from a population standpoint. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about infrastructure and investing in infrastructure generally these days, and money to do so from the feds. But as you talk about aviation in this state, where do you think we are in 2023?
Well, we're really coming out of the pandemic still. There was a lot of talk about, air service wouldn't return the same, that maybe business travel wouldn't come back the way it would, personal travel wouldn't. But we're seeing all of it quickly return. And we use CACC as kind of the health barometer for the aviation system. So, during the pandemic, we WSDOT tracked how people were getting on aircraft at CACC. And we saw as the numbers grew and went down, depending on where we were in the stages of the pandemic. But, we're almost right back where we were at the height of 2019 levels. And so 2019 is when we kind of hit a high mark at CACC. And now it looks like we're kind of bouncing around that level. But all indications are that we will continue past that mark, that business travel is continued with the uptick as well as personal travel. And then CACC at some point is just quite simply going to run out of capacity. So we've got to look across the state as we look at the system of airports and how we're going to facilitate that capacity. And when we talk about capacity, we're talking about air passenger service, we're talking about air cargo operations, and we're talking about general aviation. So as part of that, we look at, what the current state is, but then we look at all of these things that are coming our way in the future, and how we can best kind of posture ourselves as a state to take advantage of those opportunities. So that's when we really start looking at a statewide system.
It seems like, as with a lot of infrastructure, that not a lot has changed over the last several decades when it comes to airports and airport capacity. I mean, certainly we've had terminal upgrades and expansions, but in my lifetime, I haven't seen a new airport in this state. We have in Colorado and some other places. But are you thinking of this as sort of a once in a generation or once in half century sort of moment for aviation and aviation capacity in this state, kind of over the next 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, you're right. The country as a whole has not seen a large number of new airports added to the system. Within Washington State alone, we have 132 public airports or public use airports. And then as a part of those, 11 of those are commercial service airports. So they have some kind of commercial operations within them. So yeah, you're right. This is kind of a once in a lifetime event for Washington State. But what makes it really challenging is where our population base sits within the Puget Sound area, the bulk of the population in and around Seattle, and siting an airport or increasing capacity to accommodate the people and the air cargo that feed that population base. So that's what's really challenging about the work we're doing right now.
Let me sort of jump into the future, or the idea of what could happen in a perfect world. I thought that there was even talk at one point that you could expand airport operations in, for instance, Moses Lake, and have some sort of high-speed tunnel transport, light rail type of transport from the Seattle area over there. Obviously, that would be a huge investment, costly, and very, I don't even know if the technology exists to do that, but are there options like that on the table anymore? Were those sort of fantastical ideas at one time?
Well, I think it falls somewhere between the fantastical ideas and truth and reality. And it all gets to the point of where the population base is. So for instance, a few years ago, we had what was something called a joint air cargo study. And so we were looking at where we could increase air cargo capacity and how we could better utilize the system that we have. So we looked at Grant County International as a part of that. And so as a result, some things did move to Grant County. For instance, it doesn't make sense to pick cherries on the east side of the state, truck them over to CACC, and then fly them out of CACC. Let's fly them out of Grant County International. So those things have occurred. So, where it makes sense, it's good to use the airports that we have on the east side of the state. But where it doesn't make sense is where your cargo is going to the west side of the state and it's flying into the east side of the state. Because now we're just adding to the problems that we already have with roads and greenhouse gas emissions by trucking things too far from one point to the other.
So for passenger travel, and going back to CACC then, when is CACC expected to reach its capacity?
So CACC has something called the Sustainable Aviation Master Plan. That's the plan that would grow it to capacity. Now, that plan has not been approved and is still in the works, so that's important to note. So at capacity, it would hit somewhere around 60 million annual passengers. And at the height, they saw about 50 million annual passengers. Now, the need that we're talking about is over 100 million annual passengers. So when you combine the potential for CACC, the potential for Payne Field, we get somewhere around, if the projections hold true, and these are forecasts, so things could change, the need is around 27 million annual passengers. That would be the unmet need if we didn't go do anything beyond CACC and its Sustainable Aviation Master Plan, again, has not been approved, right, and Payne Field expanding its existing commercial
So
service.
When would that, and obviously we're going to talk in the second half much more about siting another airport, but when would the 100 million capacity be needed? Is that a decade away, 20 years away?
It's really over 20 years away. So we're looking at 2050 is the horizon. Okay. But somewhere around the year 2027, and maybe a little bit beyond, we're going to start feeling the pressure if we don't add capacity. So one of the things that the Commission has talked about is it makes sense to add capacity where possible over time, because the forecast could change. People already have different options of where they can live and work. Yep. People are moving to different places, but it remains to be seen just how much of that is going to play out.
I want to just offer some stats here on aviation in Washington and airports in particular. There was a study done in 2020 that showed the state's 134 public use airport systems contributed over 400,000 jobs and about $27 billion in labor income and $107 billion in total economic impact. Can you speak to the importance of aviation and this infrastructure in this state and to our economy?
Yeah, there's really no way of I don't think of overstating it, of how important it is. I mean, we live in an aerospace state. Much of our economy revolves around either the production of aircraft or things that feed the production of aircraft and other assembly lines as well, as well as pilot training, et cetera. So what will happen if we don't meet capacity is there's going to be trade-offs. So, we may not reach our maximum potential economically if we're not able to, meet the capacity requirements. But then again, there again are some of the trade-offs. When you talk quality of life for people, what is the definition of that? Do you want to facilitate aviation capacity just to be able to meet the need, or are there certain trade-offs that should be considered where maybe we don't meet all the capacity?
So what would a trade-off look like? How might we avoid needing that 100 million capacity?
So let's say one of the things that the commission was asked to do by the people, as we went and asked people, what is your preference? People led with, let's add capacity to our existing airport system before we build a new airport. So we could just stick with adding capacity at existing airports, which will get us, somewhere to the 70 some million mark probably. But we'll still have the delta out there. Now, one of the thoughts that we've had, and this gets to the future of aviation, is the thought of distributed air service. So with the advent of all this new technology that at some point is going to get to us, it's a matter of, how these things get through the certification process, how reliable is, the advent of electric aircraft, hydrogen propulsion, et cetera. But what that does is it provides opportunities to have commercial service at smaller existing airports where those opportunities currently don't exist because it's cheaper to fly, the aircraft are cheaper to operate. So when that happens, we would be able to shift some capacity to those facilities, but it still won't hit that big mark of somewhere over 100 million. At least that's what we believe at this point. So that would be one of the trade-offs. And that's not a bad trade-off. But again, when you look at the economics, it may mean that we don't reach our full potential.
What does that future look like? And can you paint more of a picture for us about what might be available at a smaller regional airport where now there is not commercial service? What would that look like?
Yeah, so, in the pipeline right now, in terms of the future technology, we refer to it as emerging aeronautics technology.
Yeah.
And some of those are electric aircraft, some of those are hybrid electric aircraft, and we now even have hydrogen propulsion testing taking place in this state at Grant County International. But these are smaller aircraft. So electric aircraft, all electric, based on today's technology, is somewhere between an 11 and 15 seat aircraft. So we're talking small regional commercial service. But for airports that currently don't have service or had lost service and would like to regain that service because of the cost differential and cheaper operations, it may mean opening up new opportunities. So let's say you could fly from Olympia, for instance, to Yakima on one of these smaller aircrafts, or Olympia to Walla Walla, or Walla Walla to Spokane, whatever the case may be. It opens up opportunities for different places, and that also gets back to population. So if you now have commercial service at a community that didn't have it previously, people have a tendency to go there. Businesses are attracted to those areas where there are opportunities for commercial flights, et cetera. So it kind of changes the landscape, and it's about opportunities once again.
How significant was the recent electric airplane flight over in Moses Lake that just happened a couple of weeks ago?
Well, Alice is the name of the aircraft under the company Aviation. That was truly an historical flight. But to put it in perspective, that is a prototype aircraft. That is not the production aircraft that would go into the certification process and eventually get mass produced. So we're still some years away from that technology coming to fruition. And even once it's certified, then it has to be produced in mass numbers in order for it to be meaningful.
How many years do you think, or decades, are we away from regional electric air travel?
There's different theories about that. I put it in the 10-year mark.
Okay. I'm also hearing about things like advanced air mobility and vertiports, and I mentioned this sort of a little bit tongue-in-cheek in the introduction, but the idea that instead of waiting for a car to pick me up, someday maybe some flying machine will drop into my driveway and take me to where I need to go. And that could be to the airport to go on a trip, or somewhere else that I may be to the pharmacy. But is Washington State, I know a lot of states are investing in vertiport space and testing of this technology. Where does Washington stand with that?
So Washington has begun those investments, and they're small at this point. So we've actually been doing this work since about 2018, when we were asked to do kind of the feasibility look at electric aircraft. We started with focusing on regional travel for advanced air mobility. But that morphed into what you're referring to as air taxis, better known as eVTOL, or electric vertical and takeoff landing aircraft. Looks like a helicopter with a lot of spinning blades, powered by batteries.
Or like a drone that can carry a person.
Exactly. Some of them just look like oversized drones, depending on who the company is that's doing the research and development. There's a lot of different fascinating designs out there right now. But so what we've done within the state is we've encouraged airports to begin doing the planning to facilitate vertiports at their locations. So as airports are going through and updating the airport master plans, they're giving thought to this. We've already seen some of them that are already getting put into plans. Where would I site it? What would the electricity needs be, et cetera, et cetera. So they're posturing themselves for it. At the onset, the belief is we're going to see airport to airport use, because that's the easiest path to take. Where it's going to be challenging is when you go airport into communities. So if you're going from CACC into Bremerton or something like that, into the community itself, setting up those vertiport locations is probably going to be the most challenging aspect of it.
So if electric air travel might be a decade or so away, how far away do you think these types of devices, flying craft, are in our future?
It's hard to tell because some of these appear to be kind of neck and neck. If you look at the company Joby out of California, Joby's had aircraft in the certification process for some time now. Many of the developers have literally thousands of hours on their aircraft. So it's going to be interesting to see what comes to fruition first and what hits mass production as well. But for eVTOL aircraft, we're talking even smaller capacity aircraft. So 3 to 4 seat aircraft. And you're right, it's akin to an air taxi or Uber Air, as it was well known to begin, is what we're probably going to see first.
And when you talk with your colleagues who are focused on ground transportation, how does the intersection of the kind of advent of modern air travel start to address some of the problems we've got on the ground?
Well, it's a great question. One of the things that we've tried to dispel is that air taxis would relieve the congestion problem. That's just not true in the near term. If you think about an air taxi, it's a 3 to 4 seat aircraft, and its ability to take meaningful numbers of vehicles off the road. Now we're talking about thousands of these aircraft flying at any given time to be able to do that. But what it does do, though, is it provides another mode of transportation that can connect with other modes. So what we believe will make it successful is the integration with other modes. So if you're flying an air taxi, maybe it connects with public transportation somewhere else as a part of ground transportation.
So this is the future, and maybe not the immediate future, but in our lifetime future. Let's get back to the here and the now. And as the state is thinking about expanding airport capacity, we've also got all of these existing airports with infrastructure needs. There is federal infrastructure money coming to the states, or will be coming to the states, to address this. But you all did a study, an airport investment study, that showed that the states, again, 134 public use airports, will need somewhere north of $3.5 billion in projects over the next 20 years. The WSDOT's Airport Aid programming is providing an average of $1.1 million in state airport grants per year. How do you address that gap? Is the federal infrastructure package coming to the rescue? What does that problem look like?
So you're right, that is a big problem. So we have what I would call legacy issues, and that's basic airport infrastructure. That's pavement, that's terminal building, that's towers, that's maintaining airport grounds, lighting systems, et cetera. And then there's all this emerging technology that we have to prepare for at the same time. So if you look at just the legacy technology or the legacy infrastructure needs you're talking about, there has been a big gap. So there have been a number of efforts by legislators to address that gap. We recently saw plus up in the grant funds from an increase of fuel taxes, aviation fuel taxes that went from 11 cents to 18 cents. So we'll start reaping the benefits of that this year. We already have. So we'll apply that to grants. The federal grants have come in and will continue to come in. So we're in the process of right now of re-gauging, where we stand in terms of infrastructure. So our basic barometer for that is something that we refer to as pavement condition index. So we're getting ready to start a study that takes place every 3 to 4 years. Once we get the results back of that, we'll have a better gauge of, where we stand with all this influx of funds that we receive from the federal government and the small amount of plus up that we received.
Is there a sense, though, that between, and I know that, there was, when this study was done in 2015, it was identified that the state would need to kick in more, but is there a sense that between the plus up and the federal funds coming, that backlog, if you will, of maintenance or upgrades, is that need can be met over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I think we're still going to be in a need scenario. So if you look at all the federal funds we received, all that we're supposed to receive, you put inflation on top of that, the amount of money that we were spending now requires much more. So when you, for instance, if you got a bid back for a project that was $1 million a year ago or 2 years ago, you can count on that being 1.5 million or 2 million now. So just our dollars aren't going to go far enough. So we suspect that the need is still going to be there. It may just not be as great as it was before.
Just a couple of minutes left. I do want to ask about the environmental impact of aviation, and in particular, the emissions from the fuel that's burned. I know that we've talked about electric planes, which would solve that problem, but there's also, I know, research into alternative and new fuels and fuel blends. What does that future look like, especially as we look to try to reduce the carbon footprint of aviation?
Yeah, we refer to that kind of as the near-term solution or near-term strategy. And this is really a global endeavor right now to use sustainable aviation fuel. It is recognized as really the only thing that can be done in the near term to really reduce emissions. So there are opportunities for Washington State to produce and distribute sustainable aviation fuel. And there's groups right now that are working on that process. So our hope is that we're going to see that as a bridging strategy, and that it's available in meaningful numbers when we start looking at increasing aviation capacity. As a matter of fact, one of the recommendations that was made recently to the commission, and I hope it sticks, is that we need to lead with these things to reduce carbon emissions before we build a new facility. In other words, you have certain things in place, so it becomes conditions-based, that you have sustainable aviation fuel in meaningful numbers before you add large amounts of capacity to the system.
Sticking with the fuel question, I understand that smaller general aviation aircraft are the only ones still using leaded fuel, but that there's an end date, a sunset date for that, and that's going to require a lot of equipment switch outs, costly to do. Is this something WSDOT's involved in, paying attention to?
To a certain degree. The thought is, and the emphasis is on what they call drop-in fuel. So a drop-in fuels would not require the drastic change outs in equipment, et cetera. You literally just drop it into the existing infrastructure. So there are some of those approved fuels that are starting to come out, but they are not in great numbers at this point.
So just lastly, what would you, and as we transition into the second half and talking about siting potentially a new airport, what would you, what's your message to the public?
Well, a couple of things. There's a lot of misnomers out there right now. Some of those misnomers are that there's a project already underway. There is no project. The commission is doing its work now to identify recommendations that legislators will need to decide whether or not to act on. Then it will have to go through the FAA process. So we are a long way away from actually having a construction plan. So there is no project at this point. But the second thing is, because we have WSDOT folks involved in it, I'm Director of Aviation for WSDOT, I chair the commission, that it's a WSDOT effort. It's not a WSDOT effort. It's a commission that was appointed by the governors to address this challenge. And the other thing is, there's no preconceived notions. There's nothing that's already been set that we're going to do this and that we're just kind of going through the process. The commission is literally trying to figure out what the best course of action is, to make solid recommendations based on technical data and input from the public on what people want in terms of adding capacity for our state. So it's a challenging process, but there's definitely trade-offs of not meeting demand in the long run and meeting demand, as we talked about.
Okay, David Fleckenstein, the Director of Aviation for the Washington Department of Transportation. We appreciate your time. Thanks very much. And when we return, Washington needs more airport capacity, but finding where to expand an existing airport or build a new one is not easy. We'll get the latest from two members of the commission working on this issue. Back right after this.
We're hoping we can get a sizable population in each area within 3 years.
We're always on edge, hoping that whenever the next storm rolls through, that lightning doesn't strike in our area to burn down more habitat.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. What happens when CACC Airport reaches capacity and can't expand anymore? That reality is not too far off, and that means the state of Washington is looking for places to expand airport capacity. The problem is communities don't necessarily like the idea of more planes taking off and landing nearby. It's a challenging conundrum, and my next two guests are in the thick of it. Joining me now are two members of the state's Commercial Aviation Coordinating Commission. Warren Hendrickson is the senior manager for the Olympia Regional Airport, but is here in his capacity with the Washington State Aviation Alliance. Also here is Steve Edmiston, an attorney and resident of Des Moines, which is obviously a very heavily impacted community because of CACC Airport and its proximity to that airport. So welcome, gentlemen. Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So why don't we, as we get into this, you can each explain the hat you wear and sort of the contingent or community you represent. And Warren, let me start with you. You're a non-voting member on this commission.
That is correct. The commission has a total of 26 slots, 15 voting, 11 non-voting. One of the non-voting slots was dedicated to the Washington State Aviation Alliance, and I served that organization as its vice president and was appointed by the organization to be the delegate to the commission. The Washington State Aviation Alliance is a consortium of 8 different general aviation organizations, not commercial, not military. General aviation, pilots associations, seaplane pilots, airport management associations throughout the state, with the intent of joining together with one voice on behalf of general aviation for the purpose of legislative advocacy.
Got it. Okay. Steve.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I live in the city of Des Moines, so I'm in the shadow of CACC Airport. And obviously, this is not about CACC Airport. But I think it's a good thing that there's been recognition that CACC is at or near capacity, and that something has to give. As you mentioned, it's going to be a conundrum. I am a lawyer, but I'm not an aviation lawyer. I am essentially a citizen activist in that airport neighbor community. I've been active on a number of committees and commissions, as you might expect. So probably more than anything, the thing I'm here to add, hopefully, is I spend a lot of time walking in the shoes of a community that might be receiving some news that an airport's coming.
And what does that look like, and what does that feel like, and what do the interests of the people on the ground amount to? Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so you're in the midst of this process. There has already Payne-Field in Everett has been identified as a target site or optimal site for expansion. So let's start there before we talk about building new airports. Why Payne-Field, and what does its future look like?
So Payne-Field already is a host to commercial air service. It has 24 departures a day. It's limited to that by an agreement with the local community and the FAA. During the pandemic, it reduced its departures below that level, but I think they're close to achieving, if not already have achieved, back to that 24 maximum. So the fact that commercial aviation already exists there in a private terminal, and in fact has been well received by those using it, it makes sense to go ahead and expand that capability. And when you also look at its location with regard to the Puget Sound population base, it also serves as a center point within 90 minutes of a good segment of the Puget Sound region for population for
Is this a fait
arrivals and departures.
accompli at this point? Has this been decided? Or
No. It's just a recommendation at this point. They have existing commercial service. Ultimately, the airport itself is in the process of an airport master plan update. This is something that's done under Federal Aviation Administration guidance that every 8 to 10 years, it looks at the forecast and what should the airport do, what should its role be in the future. So that process is going on, and part of that process will be what role will commercial service play in Payne-Field's future.
Okay, so Steve, let's get right to what a community might think about this. So already they've got commercial traffic coming in and out, so it wouldn't be that unusual to, perhaps expand that. On the other hand, there is a limit on how much there is, and people may not want more planes taking off and landing a day.
Well, and I'm no expert on Payne-Field, but Payne-Field's going to have, really the same set of concerns and worries, if you're just a citizen in that community, that the citizens at CACC are having right now, or that any major airport that's planning an expansion. CACC has a SAMP, and we may talk about that, but it also is, even though we are seeing a capacity issue, it is planning as part of its master planning process to grow significantly. Both communities may or may not be on board with that. So I think from our standpoint as a commission, we're not being asked to, wave a wand and say this is a good idea at Payne-Field or a bad idea, or a good idea at CACC or a bad idea. But it does represent a mathematical contribution to what is our capacity. So if Payne-Field were not to expand, and if CACC were not to expand, good or bad, right or wrong, it means something as far as what's the gap. So if those expansions don't happen, the gap is bigger. And that's why the commission has to think about those two sites.
Okay, so let me just step back and ask a broader question. What has struck you both so far in this process? Has it been more controversial than you thought? Has it been more complicated or difficult? Is it sort of what you expected, that siting a new or expanded airport wouldn't be an easy task? What are some observations so far?
Thank you, Austin. A couple of thoughts stand out to me. One, the Herculean nature of this task. This is huge. We haven't undertaken a study like this in Puget Sound in over 30 years. And the concepts that were identified 30 years ago are still the concepts that exist today, only they're more complex because of the region's growth. So it's an incredibly difficult task. But we have to reach a conclusion because the economic vitality of the Puget Sound region is dependent upon the aviation marketplace. How do we satisfy that need? The second point that really has struck me is the quality and expertise of the commission members. In retrospect, as a bird's eye view, I also serve the commission as the vice chair in that role as a non-voting member. The level of expertise at the table, we definitely have the right people at the table. Critical thinkers, every single one. Everybody brings a unique perspective, and it's a very collaborative, very congenial, and all mindful of our guiding principles as a commission and the nature of the task before us. Those are two things that really stand out for me.
Great. Steve, what about you? Impressions?
Well, I think one of the things that, we all have these stories right now, but it turned out we started this commission and this thing called the pandemic happened. And so everything we thought we would be doing in terms of meeting in person, having breakout groups that were in person, that got set aside. And so we've become a Zoom organization. And I think that, I think that's been a bit of a challenge for us like everybody else. And I think the frequency with which we've been able to meet has been somewhat challenged. But despite that, I think everything Warren says is correct, that we have a lot of expertise, and the people that are there to represent a stakeholder are doing a great job. Now, as someone who's there to, in a sense, represent the citizens' view, I think I'm doing the job that citizens always do, which is you look around a table and go, how am I not outgunned here? How am I not outmanned here because I'm a citizen, but I've got all the airlines, all the airports, all the freight haulers, all those stakeholders. Having said that, I feel well respected and my views are being heard. I do think that our commission does struggle a little bit with sort of how we always do business if you're in that industry, in the sense of, well, we'll get to, when we pick a site, figuring out what all those environmental and public health impacts are going to be, because that's the normal way of doing business. And I think we will be wise, and I think we'll get there. I think we still have time to get there. We need to do that earlier instead of later. We can't just wait for a environmental assessment. We should be on that right now.
And that was David Fleckenstein's point too. Fleckenstein, sorry, that he thinks, for instance, the issue about carbon emissions needs to be addressed before, not after you do this expansion or build a new airport. So that also kind of leads me to wonder, is there a way, or could technology start to address some of the impacts to the communities and people on the ground? For instance, I can't imagine you could make a jumbo jet much quieter than it already is. It's pretty noisy, but are there ways to mitigate that, creative ways that are being considered or that should be considered?
I think there are, and there are probably, sort of creative ways we don't know yet that will come to us. But even right now, and this has been discussed by the commission, and I know that our Senator Kaiser, who's a non-voting member, has talked about this on the commission. We can work with communities in advance of making this decision to make, as part of our recommendation, interlocal agreement, an agreement that says, if we do this, we have to discuss whether we will not allow night flights, because we know from a public health impact standpoint that is enormously significant to all the public health negatives that come. The problem with old school design here is once the airport's up and running, the FAA runs everything and you have no power as a local community. But if you can get out ahead of that and start addressing these public health impacts or these environmental impacts in a way that might be broader, that actually pays the real cost of this activity that we are saying is necessary, we can be way out ahead of this. And that, is sort of, I think, different and new, and that's a struggle because that's not how we normally do business, which is get out ahead with helping those communities make sure that the impacts are mitigated.
Now, Warren, I know you don't represent the commercial side of aviation, but when you hear something like, well, maybe there wouldn't be night flights, or maybe we would essentially put a set of restrictions in place beforehand so that there is local control and it's not just the FAA calling the shots after the fact. How does that sit? How does that land with you, or what are you hearing on the commission when this is
Sure, absolutely. Well, if a new airport is built, and I say if because ultimately Our task as a commission is to make the technical analysis and make the recommendation. And then we hand it to the state legislature. So the fact that the commission will make a recommendation in June of next year doesn't necessarily mean a new airport was going to be built.
Right.
However, we also recognize that the capacity needs of the Puget Sound region will not be met without a new airport. That wasn't a given at the beginning of our work 3 years ago. But as we researched and did the analysis, it's clear that a new airport, if the capacity is to be achieved, will need to be reached. This will not be our mom and dad's airport. We think of CACC and we think of CACC 2.0. No, this airport cannot be a CACC duplication. It has to, from day one, include all of those capabilities and emerging technologies that are possible, even if they're still on the drawing board. We're looking at a 15 to 20 year planning and construction process for it really to achieve its goal. And that gives us time to go ahead and incorporate those, whether it be with the communities and those agreements, or whether it be emerging technologies, electric aviation, sustainable aviation fuels, unleaded fuel for the general aviation population. The end result is we have to address that at the outset. That is the only way we're going to get buy-in from the community and politically throughout the region.
Okay, so we've talked about expanding Payne Field. That could already create some pain points in that community. And then, as you said, the commission has decided if you want to meet this need for 100 million passengers throughput per year,
total, including arrival and departure.
Right,
yes.
that you would need then this new airport. It sounds like you have the commission has narrowed down the list to a couple of locations in Pierce County,
Yes.
Not Thurston County.
No,
or is there one in Thurston?
Two in Pierce.
Two in Pierce, one in Thurston. Okay.
Yes.
We know that the Pierce County Commission or the county government has said they don't want this. So where does that kind of leave you at this point as a commission where nobody seems to want this, at least on the west side? The idea you could sell them on this being economic development doesn't seem to be a winning concept.
It's tough when you look at the amount of displacement that will take place with both residences and businesses. How do we solve this problem? And of course, nobody wants it in their backyard, especially when your vision is what CACC is today.
Yeah.
And that's where the vision has to change, and public outreach will be part of that. But ultimately, we have to figure out what the decision will be. It's understandable that the political appointees, Pierce County Executive, the Pierce County Council, would then represent their constituency and say, we would prefer this location not be chosen. That really doesn't impact the commission's work. We are tasked by the legislature to make this recommendation, and we will. And then we will sort out the details from there as to what the best choice could possibly be down the road.
What can you say about, Steve, these locations in Thurston and Pierce counties? I'm also interested in the proximity to JBLM and whether that is a help or a hindrance.
Well, I think when we spent quite a bit of time. I just got to back up just for a second. We spent quite a bit of time not looking at greenfield sites.
And you will define what a greenfield site is.
Essentially, we'll call it maybe we'll just say a rural site.
Okay.
Far less populated community.
Okay.
And the reason we spent a lot less time at the front end of our process was, I think, as Warren has said, trying to figure out, do we already have a strip of concrete that makes more sense to expand it? And so we looked and looked and looked and looked, and
that was kind of the preferred model or preferred approach.
I think there was some obvious and inherent advantage in that. Then basically so many constraints attached to every site that was being examined. Plus they also carried the inherent baggage that typically, just typically, not always, were in more populated areas already. And if we were going to contemporaneously be looking at the environmental and public health impacts of what we do, that kept taking us, I think, and finally, quite recently in this larger scheme of our time span as a commission, decided there's no option. Another major primary aviation airport has got to be somewhere more rural. It's got to be a greenfield. We did look at the very front of the process as Eastern Washington sites, but those fell off fairly quickly simply because of, and I'm no expert in how this works, but I think it is a huge challenge for industry, for freight, for airlines, for planes coming in and out, to have it that far away that far away. So
from the central population.
From the the Puget Sound area.
Because that does seem like if you could figure it out, that would be the solution, because they've got the land, the space, the rural, you're not flying over houses necessarily. You could do this in a less impactful way.
If we woke up tomorrow and there was high-speed rail, and it turned out it was there and it had been paid for, I think we'd all be going, there's another option here. We'd say there's another option here.
But that just doesn't exist, and you can't build that to make that work.
It's not, right now, that's not on our list.
Okay. So help us picture these sites and how we would even get to them.
Well, that will be the next step in the analysis. Right now, we've identified the location from an aspect on how many passengers could these locations possibly serve. And quite honestly, the Pierce County sites do grade out a little bit higher than the one Thurston County site. The Pierce County sites are estimated to serve approximately 19 to 20 million passengers a year, depending upon which site. The Thurston County site, south of Lacey, is only expected to serve a little less than 8 million. And that's based upon a 90-minute drive at 40 miles an hour in terms of where the population base is. The other part about the Thurston County site that is a complicating factor is one of the requirements of the state legislation that created the commission was to not do anything that would negatively impact the JBLM mission. The Thurston County site does include in the southeastern quadrant of that 6-mile circle, does include JBLM property. Would that inclusion then impact negatively JBLM? Yet to be determined, but it's one of those things, the combination of what actually rises to the top in terms of the best choice.
Can you explain for those who are familiar with Western Washington or with the state generally where the Pierce County locations are, what they're near to?
Well, one is a little bit south of Graham, and the other one is a little bit southeast of the JBLM property and fence line, really toward the old Fort Lewis section of the base. And the other one is toward McKenna. And south along that way, in between essentially the Roy Y, heading down toward McKenna, almost due south of JBLM, both of them outside JBLM fence lines. The Thurston County site is just south of the Lacey urban growth area. Includes the northern portion of that circle includes the very southern boundary of the Lacey urban growth area, and is a little bit northeast of Tenino, if that's helpful. Those diagrams are on the website, by the way.
Very
so
helpful.
Everybody can see a depiction.
And I think it's worth we just came off a process as well as we got to these 3 sites where we had extensive public engagement and a significant kind of polling where we tried to get information, and it was remarkable. We got 12,000 independent written comments. I mean, I think amazing number, and of course that was for all of the 12 rural sites at that time. But I think the learning from that is that these sites, even if we refer to them as greenfield or even if we refer to them as rural, there are many people still there. There are farms, there are heritage, tracts of land, there's wildlife. We will run into every conceivable problem that we can imagine at some scale, whether it's public health, whether it's environment, all these things. I think our process right now, though, is what is important is that we start to contextualize as between the 3 sites. We need to pick. If we're picking one, we really need to be drilling in now. So you need to have us back in 2 months so we can talk about the distinctions between these 3 sites as far as what can be done to impact the fewest number of people in the least dangerous way.
And nothing about each of those, if I may.
Yeah.
Nothing about those 3 6-mile circle sites is written in stone. They can move, they can adjust. Maybe there will be additional factors with additional analysis that may dictate they be combined or moved or adjusted in some way, so to be a little bit more palatable.
Is there any part of you going through this process that thinks, since there is no perfect location, especially in the west side, and because it will impact communities, and nobody is, sometimes you'll see that on some communities will welcome a certain type of infrastructure because they see it as economic development, and so maybe this community doesn't want it, but this one doesn't. That doesn't seem to be, this seems to be the potato nobody wants to pick up. Probably not a good analogy. So is there any part of you that thinks like, well, maybe we are going at this the wrong way, and forcing this on anybody isn't the right thing, and maybe we don't build the capacity, or we wait until we can do Eastern Washington, and that makes sense from a freight mobility and person transport standpoint.
There's two parts to that, and one is absolutely a no action alternative is certainly always an option. Let's not do anything.
Yeah.
But recognizing the growth that is predicted, and the forecasts have shown, when you go back 30 years and look at the forecast to today, and the Puget Sound Regional Council, their forecasts are spot on. So when they say in 2050, here will be the population base, we can see that. So we can see that need, and ultimately it's like the choice is no action. We artificially constrain the economic growth and development of the entire region. Okay, what consequences does that bring in terms of jobs, economic, the ability to travel, tourism, business? That's one piece of it. The second piece is thinking about out-of-the-box thinking.
Yeah.
In other words, hard choices. We understand what communities don't want. We don't want it here. Well then, if not here, where? What do we do? Where do we go? What would you support? Where could we go, recognizing that this is a regional solution? Ultimately, it may come down to very, very difficult choices. And since 3 of the sites that we're looking at now are in close proximity to JBLM, you know, it's an underlying question, but it has to be voiced. What would you rather have, a commercial airport or JBLM? Is the possibility of some shared use of land or capability available? The commission is not allowed to go there because, again, of the way the legislation is written, but somewhere those questions are being asked in circles now, and they probably will need to be part of the consideration for the longer term.
And just to be clear, and again, as you're making it clear, you don't have the authority to push this idea, but are you saying that it's possible that McCord Field, which is currently used for military aircraft only, that there could be there's a runway there already?
Well, there is, but personally, now a little bit on my background is I was in commercial aviation for 28 years. I was also a military pilot for 24 years. I was an airspace officer in the Air National Guard. So I bring certain expertise to the table, and when I look at McCord Field as the runway itself, although it's a 10,000-foot runway in a great location, no. McCord Field is not the answer because it cannot expand to the footprint that a new airport would need. Okay. You need to go to the very southern edge of Fort Lewis property where then you have open area. And essentially you would be trading electric aviation and quiet whisper jets for our helicopters and artillery particularly as examples. So
you're
the end
saying
result is there could be a trade.
A trade where you're losing some of the louder military aircraft and trading it out for something potentially quieter. So, but just to be clear, because I'm trying to track with you here, where would that military apparatus go?
Well, that's the big question.
We're talking like shifting it to a different base.
Or moving to Eastern Washington. In other words, is one of the things that we see is Fort Lewis, the Army trains at Yakima.
Yeah.
The C-17s in McCord already train at Grant County, Moses Lake. The military, and again, as a military veteran, 24 years, sir, tell me where I should report, and I go there.
So what you're saying is, as somebody who frequently, where I live, hears low-flying Black Hawk helicopters and other military aircraft, oftentimes in the middle of the night, and often at times when it wakes me up, you might say, look, Austin, what if that went away, but you had to accept other aircraft, but they might be next generation, they might be, you said what we used a term, whisper
jets, or the because of the stage 3 engines that are in use now.
Would you be open to maybe supporting?
And this is very hypothetical, but it's a question, and I've heard it in other circles. It probably deserves some attention, some light day, but there's going to be others well beyond the commission that will have to wrestle with how do we do this in a way that meets everyone.
Well, we're running out of time, but Steve, I want to ask you as the community, citizen representative here, do you think that kind of conversation makes sense or gets people more excited?
I think it's a great conversation to have. I think, as was mentioned, it's outside the scope of our work as a commission. So it's not going to happen as part of this process, at least to my knowledge, and we haven't spent any time on it.
Yeah. But the decision makers could expand.
But when we make a recommendation, I would hope that the decision makers are like saying, well, that's one piece of information, nice recommendation, Warren, but we got to do some more work, right? Yeah. And that's what's going to happen. I would share this because I think it's apropos to that notion, and the 3 sites is that one of the hazards here, and it's really hard to navigate. But having even lived near CACC, where we talk about usage of runways, it inherently pits communities against each other. It's simply not an activity. It's not a project that allows us to easily mold consensus. So if I live on 16th Avenue in Des Moines, but you decide today's the day for the third runaway, I get it all, right? And somebody else doesn't. And so if we make these policy shifts, even at that granular level, it has a huge impact. So here we are, we have 3 sites that we've narrowed down to. And I can assure you that each of them would like the other 2 to have it. I mean, I'm not across the board, and that's a stereotype.
Yeah.
So, or they will say, well, why does CTAC's already a miss? Let's do more. You know, it's
And
a
they won't give it to
skyscraper.
you.
Let's build. Well, let's make. It's a skyscraper and it's full, but let's build a taller one. Let's make it taller. So it's a super complex challenge, as I think we all realize and embrace. I hope, as in my role here, is that we continue to lead on environmental and public health and those things, and figure out what we can do to not set that to the back end. If David was talking about that earlier, good for him, because he's the leader of the commission, and that's exactly where we should be.
Okay, we are out of time. Just a final word, Steve. Sorry, Warren.
Just my final word is the commission is an incredibly collaborative body. The same thing has to happen for the entire Puget Sound region. We are all in this together. We all have a stake in the outcome. We have to meet everyone's needs to be successful in this outcome.
Okay, and the timeline again.
June 15, 2023 is when the commission makes its final recommendation to the state legislature.
And there's still opportunities for the public to weigh in?
Absolutely.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Much opportunity.
Warren Hendrickson and Steve Edmiston, both members, one voting, one non-voting, of the commission that is looking for a new airport location. Thank you to both of you for talking with us. Appreciate
Thank you,
it.
Austin.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.